The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. and Mara almost let it go to voicemail because it was an unknown number and she was still in her honeymoon robe, barefoot on cold tile, laughing at something her husband had said 30 seconds earlier. She picked up anyway. A woman's voice, flat and unhurried, said, "You're not his first wife. You're not his second either, you're his fifth." Mara stood very still. Behind her, water ran in the shower, and Julian's voice drifted out, humming something off-key and happy. The woman on the phone said her name was Renata, said she used to sign her name Renata Cross, and said, "Ask him where wives 2 and 3 are. Ask him what happened to 4. Then the line went dead, and Mara stood there holding a phone that had stopped making sound, staring at her own reflection in the dark hotel window, 48 hours into a marriage she thought she understood. If you've ever had one phone call rewrite your entire life in under a minute, hit that like button right now, because what Mara found over the next 3 weeks is the kind of story you don't forget. And if you want to see exactly how a woman who looked calm on the outside took apart a man who thought he'd gotten away with it, subscribe and stay to the end, because the takedown in this one is surgical. She didn't say anything to Julian that night. She told herself it was a prank, or an ex with a grudge, or a wrong number that happened to know his last name because plenty of people knew his last name. He was a contractor with his face on billboards in 3 counties, Cross Custom Builds, the smiling man in the hard hat. She told herself all of that while she lay next to him in the dark, listening to him breathe, memorizing the shape of his shoulder the way she had for the 2 years they'd dated, and none of it worked. In the morning he made her coffee exactly the way she liked it, too much cream, and kissed the top of her head, and asked if she wanted to walk the beach before it got hot, and she said yes because saying no would have required a reason, and she didn't have one yet. That was the off detail she filed away without namming it. He never asked who had called so late. The phone had rung right there in the room. He'd heard it. He never asked. They flew home 4 days later, back to the life they'd built in a decent house in a decent suburb, and Mara went back to work reviewing claims for an insurance company, which meant she spent 8 hours a day being paid to notice when numbers didn't add up. She was good at it. She had been good at it for 11 years. And somewhere on the drive home from the airport, watching Julian's hands on the wheel, easy and confident, she made a decision without deciding to make it. She was going to find out if Renata had lied. The first week back looked like nothing had happened. Julian went to job sites, came home smelling like sawdust, ate dinner across from her, asked about her day. He was, if anything, more attentive than before the trip, brought home flowers on a Tuesday for no occasion, booked a dinner reservation at the place she'd mentioned once in passing. It should have reassured her. Instead, it made the hairs on her arms stand up, because in 11 years of reading claims she'd learned that the men who overcompensated were usually the ones covering something. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told her sister nothing. She told her best friend Priya everything. Priya was a paralegal, 34, recently divorced herself, with the particular skepticism of someone who'd read 100 settlement agreements and trusted exactly none of the men in them. She sat across from Mara in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning and listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of terrifying because Priya always interrupted. "The name again," Priya said finally. "Renata Cross. She said she used to be Renata Cross. You didn't marry a divorced guy." "You told me he'd never been married." "That's what he told me." Priya pulled out her laptop right there at the table. "Give me 20 minutes. It took less than that. County marriage records were public, searchable, unglamorous, no dramatic music, just a database and a last name. Priya turned the screen around and Mara looked at 4 entries, 4 marriage licenses, 4 different women's names next to Julian Robert Cross, spanning back 11 years. Renata Ilson married and divorced within 14 months. Danielle Frobisher married for 2 years, divorce finalized. A woman named Kate Sunderland married for 8 months. And a 4th name that made Mara's stomach drop for reasons she couldn't articulate yet. Wife number 4, according to the record, had never filed for divorce. There was a marriage license. There was no dissolution. Her name was Bethany Cross, and the record simply stopped. "That doesn't mean anything happened to her," Priya said quickly, watching Mara's face. "People move, records lag, don't build a horror movie out of a database glitch." "Told me I was his first," Mara said. "He said it on our second date. He said I've never wanted this with anyone before." "'Kay," Priya said, and closed the laptop halfway like she was protecting Mara from the rest of the page. "So now the question isn't whether he lied. He lied. Now the question is why and what he's still lying about." That night Mara didn't confront him. She told herself it was strategy, though later she'd admit part of it was fear, the specific fear of asking a question you can't take back. Instead she started small. She asked over dinner in a voice she'd practiced in the car whether he'd ever been married before. He didn't even look up from his plate. "No," he said, "told you that." "Checking," she said and smiled, and felt something in her chest go very cold and very quiet, a feeling she would come to recognize over the following weeks as the exact opposite of panic. The feeling of a door closing softly on the part of her that still wanted to be wrong. The second beat came 4 days later, and it came from money, because it almost always does. Mara was doing what she always did on Sunday nights, sitting with a cup of tea and the joint checking account app, reconciling numbers out of habit more than necessity. She found a recurring transfer she didn't recognize, $600 a month, automatic, going out on the 3rd of every month to an account labeled only BC Trust. She stared at the initials for a long time before her brain connected them to the name on that unfinished marriage record. Bethany Cross. She didn't ask him about it directly. Instead, she called the bank on her lunch break, pretending to be reviewing a dispute, and got exactly as far as confirming the transfer existed and was routed to a trust account before the representative, apologetic, told her she'd need to be a listed party on that specific sub-account to get further detail, and she wasn't. She hung up and sat in her car in the parking garage and thought about the word trust and how strange it was, how a word could mean two completely opposite things depending on who was using it. She called Priya from the garage. "There's a trust account. He's been paying into it every month since before I met him." "An ex-wife. Or for someone he's still married to," Mara said, and saying it out loud made it real in a way the database entry hadn't. "Priya, what if the divorce from wife 4 never happened? What if he married me while he was still married to her?" There was a silence on the line, the kind of silence that meant Priya was doing legal math. "If that's true," she said slowly, "your marriage isn't just messy, it's void. And depending on what he told you to get you to sign anything, insurance, beneficiary forms, the deed, anything, that's not just betrayal, Mara. Some of that is fraud." That was the moment the story stopped being about heartbreak for Mara, or at least stopped being only about that. She had spent 11 years reading claims files where people lied about small things to protect big things, and she understood, sitting in that garage, that she was now inside one of those files herself, except she was the claim, and the fraud was her own life. She started keeping a folder. Not on the shared laptop, on a personal drive, backed up to cloud storage under folder name so boring no one would ever open it. Tax Docs 2019. Into it went screenshots of the marriage records, screenshots of the recurring transfer, a photo she took of an old storage unit key she found in the garage that didn't match anything they owned. She began doing what she did for a living, building a timeline. Marriage to Renata, 14 months, divorced. Marriage to Danielle, 2 years, divorced. Marriage to Kate, 8 months, divorced. Marriage to Bethany, no divorce on record. Then a 4-year gap. Then Mara, the 4-year gap bothered her more than anything else. Men who married and divorced that fast, over and over, weren't usually men who then went quiet for 4 years. She mentioned this to Priya on their next coffee, and Priya, tapping her pen against the table the way she did when a case was starting to smell wrong in a specific direction, said, "Maybe he didn't go quiet. Maybe wife 4 is why he went quiet. Maybe something happened that made him careful." "Careful how?" "Careful like a man who learned that fast, messy divorces leave a paper trail," Priya said, and decided his next move needed to look cleaner, slower, more convincing. She looked at Mara for a second too long. "Careful like you were the plan, not the accident." Mara didn't sleep that night. She lay next to Julian and watched the ceiling and thought about the ring on her finger, the ring he'd said had belonged to his grandmother, and wondered, with the specific dread of someone whose profession had trained her never to trust a story that was too neat, whether that detail was even true or whether it was just well rehearsed. The third beat arrived through Renata herself, because Mara, against every instinct that told her to stay hidden, decided the only way forward was to talk to the woman who'd made the first call. She found her through the county records, an address in the next town over, a small bakery Renata apparently owned. Mara went on a Wednesday, told no one but Priya, and sat across a cafe table from a woman who studied her with an expression that wasn't hostile, just tired, like she'd had this exact conversation before and knew how it went. "You found the trust," Renata said before Mara had even finished explaining why she'd come. "It wasn't a question. Do you know about that?" "Because I set it up," Renata said. "Well, a lawyer set it up for me, and later when I heard he'd married again I made sure Danielle knew about it too, and when he married Kate." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "It's not sentimental if that's what you're picturing. It's not him being generous to his exes out of guilt. He pays into that account because he's required to. Court order, restitution from the Bethany situation. It just runs under an old label so it doesn't show up as what it actually is on a casual bank statement. Mara felt her pulse in her throat. What happened with Bethany? Renata's face changed, not softened exactly, but something in it went careful, the way people go careful around a wound that's still healing wrong. Bethany accused him of moving money out of her name before their divorce went through, draining a business account she thought was joint. It got ugly enough that a lawyer got involved, and the court ordered restitution as part of a settlement neither of them wanted to make public because Bethany didn't want her name attached to it and he definitely didn't. That's the trust. It's not tender. It's a payment plan for something he did. Bethany alive? Mara heard herself ask and hated that the question needed asking. As far as I know, Renata said, and something in her voice suggested she genuinely didn't know for certain, which was almost worse than a clean no. We're not close. None of us are close exactly. We just talk when it matters. She looked at Mara directly. I called you because I recognized the pattern before you probably will. Fast proposal, big declarations, something about you feeling like his first, his only, like you're special in a way none of the others were. He tells all of us that. It's not a lie he tells once, it's a lie he tells for a living. Marry so many women that fast, over and over. What does he get out of it? Renata was quiet for a moment. At first I thought it was just broken, a man who needs to be adored and burns through people to keep feeling it. But by the time I heard about Kate, I stopped believing that. Ask yourself what changed financially each time right around the divorce. Ask yourself whose name went on which accounts, right after the wedding, and whose name came off right before the divorce filing. She let that sit. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm telling you to look at the paperwork like it's a stranger's, not your husband's. That single sentence detonated something in Mara, because it named exactly the mistake she'd been making, reading everything as a wife who wanted to be wrong, instead of an investigator who wanted to be right. She thanked Renata, left the bakery, and sat in her car for 20 minutes before she could make herself start the engine. If you're catching the shape of this before Mara does, drop it in the comments. And if this is the kind of story where you want to see exactly how she flips from grieving wife to the person calmly building the case that ends him, stay with it, because the next part is where she stops reacting and starts working. She went home that night and did not cry in front of Julian. She did not raise her voice. She sat across from him at dinner, and when he asked how her day was, she said, "Fine," quiet, and watched him believe her, and understood in that moment that she had just made the first move of a completely different kind of marriage, one where she knew things he didn't know she knew, and he was still operating as if the only person in the room who could be deceived was her. She called a lawyer the next morning, not Priya's firm, a different one, someone with no personal connection to either of them, a woman named Odette Ferris who specialized in marital fraud and asset concealment, and who listened to Mara's timeline without a single expression of surprise, which told Mara more than any reaction would have. "First thing," Odette said, "we need to know if your marriage is even valid. If Bethany's divorce was never finalized, there's a real possibility he married you, and possibly Kate before you depending on dates, while still legally married to someone else. That's not just embarrassing for him. In this state that's bigamy and it voids any marriage entered into afterward, which matters enormously for what happens to your house, your accounts, and anything with both your names on it. Put my name on the house 2 weeks after the wedding," Mara said slowly. "He said it was romantic." "A gift," Det's expression didn't change but her pen stopped moving. "Do you know if he changed the beneficiary on any insurance policies, retirement accounts?" "I don't know, I never checked." "Check," Odette said, quietly, "this week. Because I've seen this pattern before, and I want to say something to you plainly, not to scare you, but because you need to hear it stated once, cleanly. Men who marry and divorce this fast, this many times, aren't usually doing it for love, and they're rarely doing it only for money either. Sometimes they're doing it because a wife who trusts you completely will sign anything you put in front of her, and a wife who's only been married a few weeks hasn't learned yet to read the fine print." Mara went home and did not check the accounts that night, because Julian was home, moving through the kitchen with the particular ease of a man who had never once considered that the person pouring his coffee might be building a case file against him. She waited until he left for a job site 2 towns over, told him she was working from home, and instead spent the day going through every document in the house she could find, insurance folders in the filing cabinet, a locked drawer in his home office she opened with a hairpin and shaking hands, because Odette had told her clearly that anything she found in a shared home she had every right to look at. In the drawer, she found 3 things that mattered. A life insurance policy, taken out 4 weeks before the wedding, with her listed as sole beneficiary at a value that made her hands go cold, $800,000, far more than anything Julian had ever told her he was capable of, funded by a business account she didn't know existed. A folder of financial statements for a company called Cross Custom Holdings, which as far as she knew was not the same entity as the contracting business he actually ran job sites for. And at the very bottom, a printed email chain between Julian and someone named Marcus Doyle, dated 6 weeks before the wedding, that made her sit down on the office floor and read it twice to be sure she understood it correctly. The emails weren't explicit. They didn't say the word plan, but they didn't need to. Marcus wrote, "You sure this one's different? Last two got cold feet before the year mark and you had to walk away with nothing." Julian wrote back, "She's not like the others. She trusts too easy. Give it 8 months after the policy's active, maybe less if I play it right." Marcus wrote, "Just don't get sloppy like Bethany, that almost buried you." Julian's reply was 4 words. Bethany didn't understand timing. Mara sat on the floor of the office with the printed pages in her lap and felt, for the first time since the phone rang on her honeymoon, something other than fear. It was quieter than fear. It felt almost like relief, the specific relief of no longer needing to guess. If you've ever had the moment where the fear finally turns into certainty, like the floor stops shaking, because you've finally found solid ground, comment, certainty below, because that's exactly where Mara is right now, and everything from here is her choosing exactly how this ends. She did not confront him that night. She did not confront him the next night either. Instead, she called Odette first thing the following morning and read her the emails word for word, and Odette was silent for a long moment before she said, "Mara, I need you to understand what you're holding. This isn't a messy marriage anymore. Depending on what happens in the next 8 months, this reads like the early architecture of a plan to make you disappear, or make it look like you left, or worse, and I say that not to frighten you into paralysis, but because you now have leverage, and leverage only works if you use it before he knows you have it." "I want him to lose everything," Mara said, and her voice didn't shake, which surprised her. "Not just leave, lose everything. Publicly if I can manage it, so the next woman gets a phone call from someone with proof instead of just a warning." Odette's voice when she answered had something like approval in it. "Then we don't confront him, we build, quietly. You keep behaving exactly like the wife he thinks you are. We get copies of everything, the emails, the policy, the trust records, the marriage licenses, into a secure file with a forensic timestamp. I bring in an investigator to formally document the bigamy question with Bethany's actual marital status, because if that marriage was never dissolved, your marriage is void, and voiding it changes what he's legally entitled to fight you for. And we find out exactly what Marcus Doyle's role is, because a man helping someone plan this isn't an innocent bystander. Investigation moved carefully after that, in the specific rhythm of people who have learned patience is a weapon. Odette's investigator confirmed within a week what Mara had already feared. Bethany Cross's divorce had been filed but never finalized. Stalled in a bureaucratic gap, Julian had apparently exploited deliberately, meaning his marriage to Kate and his marriage to Mara were both legally void from the start. Priya, working her own angle through court records, found that Marcus Doyle wasn't a friend at all. He was a licensed insurance broker who had personally written or brokered policies for at least 2 of Julian's previous marriages, both of which had ended not in divorce payouts to Julian, as Mara had first assumed, but in early policy cancellations right before things got messy, a pattern that read less like coincidence and more like a business relationship built on rehearsal. "He's done this before and backed out," Priya said, spreading the documents across her kitchen table one night while Julian was at a site meeting. "Something always spooked him before it went all the way. Maybe a wife got suspicious, maybe Bethany's lawyer got too close, but this time the policy's already active, the beneficiary's already locked in, and the emails say 8 months. You need to know what month you're in." Mara did the math out loud flatly like reading a claim number. "Month 5. The room went quiet. "Then we don't have the luxury of slow anymore," Odette said when Mara called her that night. "We moved to a controlled confrontation, not one where you scream at him in a kitchen, one where every word he says is on record, in a setting he doesn't control, with consequences already loaded and waiting the second he opens his mouth." They built the trap over the following 2 weeks with the precision of people assembling a structure that had to hold weight. Odette arranged, through a contact, a private meeting framed to Julian as a routine estate planning consultation, a chance, his wife told him sweetly over dinner, to finally get our will sorted, since we're doing this whole marriage thing properly. He agreed easily, even seemed pleased. The particular pleasure of a man who believed the paperwork was going exactly according to a plan only he knew about. What he didn't know was that the estate attorney was Odette, that the meeting room was wired for recording with full legal consent since Mara was a party to the conversation, and that Marcus Doyle would be present too, having been separately and quietly subpoenaed for records that made him considerably more cooperative than he wanted to be. The meeting began ordinarily. Julian sat beside Mara, hand on her knee, performing warmth for a room he thought was friendly. Odette walked through routine language, beneficiaries, asset division, standard boilerplate, and then, without changing her tone at all, said, "Before we finalize anything, I want to clarify the status of your marriage to Bethany Cross, since that affects the validity of every document we're discussing today." Julian's hand went still on Mara's knee. "That's not relevant. We divorced years ago." "Actually," Odette said, sliding a single page across the table, "you didn't. The petition was filed. It was never finalized, which means your marriage to Kate Sunderland was void, and your marriage to Mara is void as well." She let the silence hold for exactly as long as it needed to. "Which is a problem for you, Mr. Cross, because it means the $800,000 policy you took out 4 weeks before your wedding, naming a legal spouse as sole beneficiary, was written on a marriage that never legally existed. Which raises questions about intent that Marcus can probably speak to better than I can." Marcus, sitting 2 seats down, said nothing, which was its own kind of confession. Julian's composure didn't shatter all at once, it came apart the way cheap material does, in small tears that widen. "This is insane, you're twisting things." "Bethany and I, that was a misunderstanding, a filing error, that's not." "Read your own words back to me," Mara said, speaking for the first time, and her voice was perfectly level, the voice she used when she denied a fraudulent claim across a desk from someone hopping she wouldn't notice the inconsistency. She placed the printed email chain on the table in front of him. "She's not like the others. She trusts too easy. You wrote that about me, Julian. 6 weeks before you married me." She watched his face while he read it, watched the exact moment recognition became panic. "Bethany didn't understand timing. That's what you wrote. I understand timing perfectly now." He tried 3 more sentences, none of which finished, and Odette let him fail at each one before she said calmly, "Everything said in this room today is recorded with full consent of one party present, which is legal in this state. Copies of these emails, the marriage records, and the insurance documentation have already been filed with the district attorney's fraud division and are being reviewed alongside a formal bigamy complaint. Marcus, your broker's license is currently under review by the state board, which I'd guess is why you agreed to sit here and say nothing at all." Marcus, to his credit or his cowardice, chose that exact moment to start talking quickly about how it was all Julian's plan, how he'd only written the policies, how he hadn't known details Mara found she genuinely did not care about, because she had already gotten what she came for, which was not an apology and not a confession delivered with tears, but a room full of people finally forced to say true things out loud. She stood up before Julian finished sputtering his last defense, picked up her copy of the folder, and said the only thing she'd planned to say all along. "The house is in my name. The account you drained to fund that policy is being frozen this afternoon. And the marriage you thought made me your 5th win is void, which means you don't get to call me a wife at all. You get to call me the woman who found the pattern before you finished running it." She walked out without waiting for a response, because she'd learned over 3 weeks of quiet, methodical work that the last word mattered far less than the paper trail that followed you long after the words stopped. In the months after, the district attorney's office moved slowly but surely. The bigamy complaint, the insurance fraud referral, the broker's license suspended pending a hearing where Marcus testified against Julian in exchange for a lighter charge of his own. Bethany, when Mara finally called her, cried on the phone for reasons that had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with finally being believed. Renata sent Mara a single text after the news became local gossip, 4 words, "Told you the pattern." Mara kept the house. She kept her job. She changed the locks the same week the case was filed, though by then Julian had already been served and was, according to Priya's sources, staying with an aunt 2 states away, telling anyone who'd listened that he'd been misunderstood. Mara didn't give an interview. She didn't post anything triumphant. On the first cold evening of autumn, months after all of it, she sat alone at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, the folder that had started as Tax Docs 2019, now sitting closed in a drawer she rarely opened, and looked at her own hand bare now no ring steady. Outside, the street was quiet. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt simply like herself again, A woman who had learned, at close and unbearable range, that the most dangerous thing in a marriage isn't a lie told once, but the ease with which someone can tell it 5 times and still find a woman willing to believe it was only ever meant for her. If this story kept you until the very last word, you already know what to do. Like it, subscribe for the next one, and tell me in the comments which moment hit hardest, because there's another story just like this one waiting for you next.